Over the last several decades, the tools available for mixing audio have evolved. And when the tools evolve, our skills and strategy must evolve too. This video is sponsored by OXSound, which is a plugin company that's played a big part in this evolution over recent years. They just released a new plugin called Bloom. I'll show you more on that in a moment. First, let's look at a couple of key plugin developments that have changed the way we mix. In the early days of digital, there was a stark difference between the almost sterile perfection of digital signal processing, or DSP, and the vibey analog gear that preceded it. As DSP improved and mixing in the box became more popular, the plugins available started to break into two basic categories: plugins that embraced the technical perfections of DSP, and plugins that emulated the technical imperfections of analog gear. You may ask, why would we want to emulate imperfections? There's a beautiful simplicity to using analog gear because it does so much more to the sound than you tell it to, thanks to the fact that it utilizes real electronic components, which are nonlinear and often exhibit very pleasing harmonic distortion. On the other hand, while you can make much more precise adjustments with DSP, a standard digital EQ or compressor won't do you any favors. They do what you tell them to do, no more, no less. But over the last decade, we've started to see some plugins that harness the power and precision of DSP in a new way. Rather than relying on the user to make every single technical adjustment themselves, new plugins like OXSound Bloom provide a much quicker and much more intuitive route to reaching a desired sound. OXSound gave me early access to the beta version of their new plugin Bloom, which I've been testing over the last few months, and I'm excited to share it with you. You may recognize OXSound from their previously released plugins Soothe 2 and Spiff, which have been praised by many engineers working at the highest levels of our industry, so there's no need to take my word for it. This stuff really is incredible. Click the link in the description below this video to start using OXSound Bloom in your DAW today with a free trial. As a student and teacher of audio myself, I think it's critical that we understand this new wave of plugins as best as we can, and particularly what it means for the way we mix audio. As a general mixing framework, I would first reach for an EQ to cut out problematic frequencies and clean up the frequency balance of each instrument, then use a compressor to define the dynamic character of each instrument, and finish off with some additive EQ and/or more colorful compression to accentuate a particular frequency range and blend each instrument into a cohesive mix. There's more than one way to mix, but this is the way I learned to do it. I think this general process is still a good framework for approaching a mix, but the way we accomplish this may begin to evolve once we have access to smarter plugins. Let's dive into the DAW. Here's a synth pad sound that's already been rendered to an audio track, which means I can no longer adjust the synth controls, and I'll need to use plugins to fit the sound into a mix. I could use subtractive EQ to cut in the low mids and cut out some of the mud. But as you can hear, there's a big problem with what I've done here. The low mid cut only fixes the resonance in the first chord. In order to correct for each chord, I'd have to use a wider cue, multiple filters, or automation. But let's set up Soothe 2 with a similar intention in mind. I'll tell Soothe 2 to be particularly sensitive in this area. And as you can see and hear, it will dynamically change with each chord. That works pretty well. In fact, Bloom on its own can do a similar thing just by turning up this amount knob. Doing this immediately brings a level of clarity to the signal that would have probably taken a human a lot of experimentation to accomplish with standard tools. If I want to deviate from Bloom's tonal curve here, I can change these parameters. While it's often easy to understand new EQ or compressor plugins in my videos, these types of plugins are much more difficult to pinpoint. I see and hear what each plugin does, but what are they? OX Sound Soothe 2 is a dynamic resonance suppressor, and Bloom is an adaptive tone shaper. The keywords here are dynamic and adaptive. Soothe 2 seems to behave like a multiband compressor with a lot of bands that automatically seek and destroy resonant frequencies when they pop up. Bloom is adaptive and context-aware, which means it responds differently to different input signals based on the perceived tonal balance. While a regular digital EQ will apply a static curve to the input signal, Bloom continuously adapts to the incoming audio to make it sound more balanced. How exactly does it do this? I have no idea. But with a plugin like Bloom or Soothe 2, I've found it's best to just experiment and listen. So here's another example. Here's an example with an acoustic guitar and a vocal. We can start by playing the raw tracks back, listening to how the two tracks interact.
I bet I know exactly what you're thinking. You got it figured out there, nobody cares. But what you don't realize is that you touch so many lives of people who want you to give life just one more chance.
Using these adaptive plugins, let's go through that basic mixing workflow: cleanup, balance, and enhancement. I'm hearing a lack of clarity in the low mids of the guitar, which can be addressed with Soothe 2.
I bet I know exactly what you're thinking. You got it figured out there, nobody cares. But what you don't realize is that you touch so many lives of people who want you to give life just one more chance.
I told the plugin to focus in on this area that seemed to lack clarity. This vocal doesn't really have that big buildup in the low mids, though that's a common problem that could be addressed with Soothe 2. It does sound a bit boxy, which is why I've chosen to use Soothe 2 in this area between 500 Hz and 1 kHz. But I pulled down the sensitivity in the high mids and highs so that we can maintain what we've already got there.
I bet I know exactly what you're thinking.
Here's before.
You got it figured out there, nobody cares.
And after.
But what you don't realize is that you touch so many lives of people who want you to give life just one more chance.
Both tracks could use some dynamics control, so I'll use a compressor on each track. On the guitar, I'm trying to control the transients, and on the vocal, I'm really just trying to balance out the performance. That should result in a better balance and more upfront vocal overall.
I bet I know exactly what you're thinking. You got it figured out there, nobody cares.
Here's before.
But what you don't realize
And after.
is that you touch so many lives of people who want you to give life just one more chance.
The balance is better, but I'd still like to adjust the frequency balance of each instrument so the listener's ear is drawn more toward the vocal. To accomplish that, I'll use Bloom on each instrument. So over here on this side, I've got the vocal, and on this side, I've got the guitar. You'll notice that I don't have any deviation yet away from whatever Bloom decides is the best balance. I'm just going to use the amount knob. Let's take them down for now.
I bet I know exactly what you're thinking. You got it figured out that nobody cares. But what you don't realize is that you touch so many lives of people who want you to give life just one more chance.
Let's add even a little bit more to the vocal to bring out the high mids.
I bet I know exactly what you're thinking. You got it figured out that nobody.
Again, I urge you to download the free trials and experiment with these plugins in your own projects because it's more difficult to explain how these things work rather than to feel how they work. Overall, I've noticed that these sorts of plugins, they seem to do what you want them to do rather than doing simply what you tell them to do. You'll know what I mean once you try them out. Okay, next let's look at some drum tracks. One thing that immediately stood out to me in this set of tracks is the ringing of the snare drum. I'll use a stock EQ to notch out the most prominent frequency that's ringing, because that's relatively easy to find and it doesn't change. But as you can hear, there's still some resonance even after doing that. Here's before and after. In this case, you could either hunt for those additional frequencies and add additional EQ bands, or open up Soothe 2. Here's before and after. I mean, look at how much is going on, and all I've told to do is sort of focus on these areas and ignore this area up here. It's doing an incredible amount of work compared to what I would have been able to do with a regular EQ. Over here on the kick, I've used Bloom to bring up some of the low end and snap. So right now, I'm just using the amount knob and letting Bloom do whatever it thinks is best. Here's before. After. But let's say I want some more low end. And let's say I want a little bit more snap. Finally, I've put another instance of Soothe 2 on the drum bus to further clarify the kit as a whole. Here's before. And after. Before. After. This is a critical thing to understand about this type of plugin. It does a lot of the heavy lifting and problem solving for you. I think there's still a place for traditional EQ, dynamic EQ, compression, and multiband compression. But it's definitely more fun and less technical to mix with these types of plugins that seem to already know the sound you have in your head. And what I like is that it's not a one knob plugin that takes all of my technical skill out of the equation. If I want to change something, it gives me a good amount of control. So it's a good blend between relying on the DSP and relying on the engineer. Don't forget to use the link below for your free trial of either plugin. Leave a comment below with an idea for how you use the plugin in your own project. In this video that's on your screen now, you'll learn about an ear training method for audio engineers that will instantly change the way you mix. I know, that's a bold claim, but I'm absolutely serious here. So click the link now and I'll see you over there.